Great. All right. Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you for braving the elements to be here. I'm Larry Dubinsky, President and CEO of the Franklin Institute, and we are so excited to welcome you to our second event in our new speaker series. We're very fortunate that we have had a generous donor, an anonymous donor, underwrite this speaker series because we feel these current science topics are so important. Please let us know what you think about tonight's program. Your feedback will help us shape the series going forward. We hope you'll also join us for future conversations in the Institute Speaker Series and for other exciting events at the Franklin Institute, such as Science After Hours, Night Skies, and our many exhibitions and programs. There's information about all of that outside of this door, and I hope as you leave this evening, pick them up on the tables. But here, tonight, we're here to discuss whether vaccine mandates, rules or laws that require people to have been vaccinated to do things like attend school, are necessary for public health. The goal of this discussion is to present scientifically informed views on the issues surrounding vaccine mandates. The overwhelming consensus of the scientific and medical community is that vaccines prevent a wide array of diseases and save millions of lives each year. We know that the concerns around vaccine use are real and that people have strong feelings about this issue. It is the Institute's responsibility as a trusted organization in the community and as a science communicator to help the public understand the science behind the vaccine discussion. It is also our responsibility to foster dialogue about the ways the science is being interpreted in society, and that is what we are here to do this evening. As I said earlier, we welcome your feedback, but please do not be disruptive during the presentation. If you obstruct others' views on stage or interrupt the conversation, you will be asked to leave the hall. Again, though, thank you for coming to this second event in our new Franklin Institute Speaker Series. Again, you can learn more about all the upcoming events outside as you leave this evening. But now, it's my pleasure to introduce you to our moderator this evening, my colleague, the Franklin Institute's Senior Vice President of Science and Education, Dr. Frederic Bertley. Dr. Bertley oversees the educational programming here at the Institute. He holds a PhD in immunology from McGill University and conducted vaccine research at Harvard Medical School. Please join me and welcome Dr. Bertley to the podium.
Thank you very much, Larry. Good evening, everyone. It's a really exciting time here to put on these great programs. As Larry Dubinsky, our president, said, we're really looking at this from a lot of the data that's out there. So I wanted to start as a scientist, use that purview, use that lens to show you just a few, very few slides. First of all, as was mentioned, vaccines worldwide actually save about 2.5 million lives per year. Right? And if you look at information from WHO, just the measles and rubella virus alone, that initiative, or that vaccine and that initiative, saves about 17.1 million lives since they started in 2000. And if you think about the USAID and the WHO, they have this thing called these grand challenges, or these 8 Millennium Development Goals. And if you look at number 4, it's about reducing child mortality. And yes, things like clean water and hygiene play a great role here, but the number one factor that's significantly able to reduce child mortality around the world is the use of vaccines, and in particular measles. This is unbelievable. Now, if you look at this country here, Center for Disease Control estimates about 732,000 children's lives have been saved in the last 20 years from vaccines. And that might seem small compared to the over 300 million cases where kids aren't getting sick over the last 2 decades because of the use of vaccines. And if you look at hospitalization rate, we're talking about 21 million cases have been saved. And while human life and children is absolutely the most critical thing, when you look at the financial impacts or the economics of this, we can see that over 200, almost $300 billion in direct savings have been because of this. And when you factor in other things, which include loss of productivity due to illness and disability and death, you're looking at about $1.4 trillion. So the impact of vaccines really is incredible. And if you take it back to the very beginning, the great Dr. Jenner from 1796, we've saved almost over 500 million lives since that period. So when you talk about an indelible impact from a scientific phenomenon, this is really here. But also, very important, especially for this discussion, is vaccines are monitored for safety, but like all medications or any medications, they have side effects, or they can have side effects. And so as you think about a decision to immunize or not, you need to understand that you might be putting children and others who come into contact with them at risk if they're not protected. And so with that, we wanted to focus this conversation tonight on mandates. We have had in the past all kinds of vaccine forums looking at what vaccines are they safe? But tonight is really to look at something that's pressing in the media, that's pressing in our society, the idea of should we mandate that or not, and what does that look like? And to do that, we brought 3 esteemed speakers. I want to start with our first one. Her name is Karen Ernst. She's a parent and the senior leadership of Voices for Vaccines. She's going to walk us through from the parental perspective and from somebody who's really interested in figuring out how do you navigate the chatter and all the noise that's out there for many of us as we make these decisions for kids and adults alike. Ladies and gentlemen, Karen Ernst.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming out tonight and braving the weather. I just want to talk a little bit about parents, vaccines, and mandates. I am, as Dr. Bertley said, I am the parent leader of a parent-driven organization that really focuses on parent-to-parent communication about vaccines. And so, as such, I asked parents, well, what do you think? Are mandates a good idea? Should we make people vaccinate without allowing them the option to opt out for religious or philosophical reasons? And I asked a lot of parents just for this evening, and I received the regular replies that I receive when we talk about mandates. From, we really have to be careful about what oversight we grant the government, about what rights we give up to the government, to, I vaccinate my kids, and it's only fair that if my kids go to school, that your children should also be vaccinated to go to school with my children. And one really poignant comment that a parent made was that we mandate vaccines for our dogs. Our dogs can't be kenneled. Our dogs can't be boarded. Our dogs need to be licensed with vaccines. We should treat children just as well. So I received a lot of comments, but one of the biggest comments I consistently received is, well, if we go ahead and float this law and say, let's take away those philosophical and religious exemptions, what's going to happen? What sort of Pandora's box are we opening? And so I just want to go through some fears and some comments that people make about what might happen, and also some experiences that I've had in trying to limit how people can exempt their children out of that requirement to vaccinate their children before sending them to school. So the first question is, can mandates backfire? And so there's a recent study that came out about, it was called Using Behavioral Interventions to Create Vaccination Policy. And it was a study done by across the world in Germany and in the United States. And they looked at how people's behavioral decision-making concerning vaccines can really work as far as vaccination policy. And one of the ideas that they floated was that it's possible that when you mandate vaccines in various settings without providing any exemption, that it actually creates a backlash against those vaccines we don't mandate. And so we all know that when we send our kids to school that there are a lot of required vaccines, but there are also vaccines that we get our children as a matter of course that aren't required, such as a flu vaccination, for example. And then there was another idea that they floated in this quote that says, beyond ethical concerns, recent evidence suggests partial compulsory vaccination may also backfire. So part of it too is that there are people who have some ethical concerns as far as what about a parent's decision making? What about a parent's right in this? And I'm not going to say a lot about that because I know that Dr. Offit has a lot to say about parents' rights and vaccines. So that's one concern. That's one possible thing that can float out of Pandora's box if we decide to mandate vaccines without exemptions. The next is, what about how will parents find those outs if they aren't available to them as a matter of course? So when we had last year the new law in California, SB 277, that took away that philosophical and religious exemption and made it so that all parents who sent their children to school, public or private school, had to vaccinate their children. We had some amount of parents looking for an out. How can I get out of this requirement even though it's a state law now? And there was some chatter about perhaps doctors will give me medical exemptions that I'm not really entitled to. My child doesn't really have a medical contraindication to vaccines. Are there doctors who might do unethical things? I really think that's probably overplayed, even though some people think that there is a doctor who possibly was selling medical exemptions. But also, parents looking for just any out that they can give. Would they do something unethical to get those outs? So that's another possible backlash we're looking at. And then there's this one, and this one I really think is possibly the most real thing that can happen when we float the idea of taking away exemptions. And this is something that I actually have personal experience with. And so last March, in the state of Minnesota where I live, we looked at just adding a requirement. We weren't even taking away religious or philosophical exemptions. We just wanted to add a requirement so that parents who wanted to opt out of an immunization requirement had to go see their doctor and have their doctor explain to them the risks that they were putting their child at and the risks to the community because they weren't immunizing. And so I sat in this hearing, in the Senate hearing about this bill, and unbeknownst to us, there was an amendment that someone was ready to tack onto it. So this amendment was floated, and it basically said that there were three parts. It basically said that parents had to be given proper information, and that sounds reasonable, doesn't it? That doctors would be required to report to VAERS anything that happened, and that they couldn't be, there couldn't be any backlash against doctors who did report to VAERS any adverse reactions. So some of this seems reasonable, but the problem is that the way they defined vaccine information, they didn't want parents to just receive the vaccine information sheets that we all receive when we go to vaccinate our children. They wanted parents to receive every single package insert that usually comes in a box with a vial of vaccine. And what that would mean is when you took your child in for their 2-month shots, for example, you would receive over 100 pages of information about the vaccine that you're supposed to sort through. So we're giving your child this vaccine today. Here's 100 pages for you to read about it. And the purpose really is to frighten people. It's to make people feel uneasy about this thing that they're consenting to. And it's to give them way more information than they would ever need. And the reason this amendment was tacked to the bill was to kill it. It was to either frighten parents away from vaccinating or to kill the bill. And this is a real concern when states try to mandate bills, is that the anti-vaccine contingent will try to float their own bills, which will not only kill the bill, but also make vaccine legislation in their state much worse. So through all of these possible negative scenarios with mandates, I decided to talk to the one person who I think experienced the most backlash, and her name is Hannah Henry. And if you know this I Heart Immunity sticker, if you've ever seen this around, you know who Hannah Henry is because she is the person who designed this. She sent her children to school in Northern California, and the schools where her children went to school had less than 50% immunization rate. And so she knew her children were at risk, and she really knew that any day now, sooner rather than later, there would be an outbreak at her children's school where her children were if she didn't do anything. And then Disneyland happened, and there was a measles outbreak. And so Hannah decided to help with trying to pass SB 277, which took away religious and philosophical exemptions in the state of California. And in doing so, she testified at various hearings. What happened to her personally, though, is really, I think, what makes parents the most concerned about the conversation about mandates, because she did end up pulling her children out of the school because she became the source of rumors that her children were talked about in ways that were mean and cruel, and that to this day she really can't get away from personal attacks against her as far as who she was. Through it all, however, she was committed. She decided that no matter what, that this bill was worth passing, that no matter what happened to her personally, it was worth protecting the children in her community, and that it was her responsibility to take the high road and to present the facts. And so through all of these possible doomsday scenarios, her question is, are you prepared to remain kind no matter what happens? That you have to present whatever information you give to other people with kindness, because that is the only way to get the information through. And so I asked her flat out, do you think it was worth it? Would you do it again? And she said, yes, absolutely. It's worth having a mandate in California, even though I suffered through all of these personal attacks. So what we really have to look at when we're considering do we mandate or no is, have we reached the tipping point? I think in California the answer is clear. When you have an outbreak of measles that starts at Disneyland, where it's supposed to be the happiest place on earth, and instead it becomes the most measly place on earth, that you really probably have reached the tipping point, and parents probably have decided enough is enough. It's time to put an end to parents who sending their children to school who are not vaccinated. So, when we think about whether or not we've reached the tipping point, one thing to look at is how important vaccine requirements are for parents as far as getting their children vaccinated. And I always like to point to the HPV vaccine because it is the least required vaccine in the country, although I think the flu might be there too, the flu vaccine. But HPV vaccine is not required for school entry in 49 states. Rhode Island, I believe, is the only state that requires that children get the HPV vaccine as a matter of signing up for school. And because of that, if you look at the greens versus the reds, the greens are vaccinated. We only have 60% of girls eligible for vaccination against HPV vaccinated in this country, and 40% of boys vaccinated. And if you ask, so what? I just want to put this in perspective for you. 4,000 women in this country today die every year from cervical cancer. This is a cancer that can be prevented with the HPV vaccine. We're only preventing 60% of those cancers in girls right now. The work we're doing is simply not enough. We will come to a time where women will be dying of cancer because we didn't prevent it, and because we're not requiring it, and because we're not reminding parents, and because we're not speaking up strongly enough against it. And if we look at the HPV vaccine, which kills, more than 4,000 people a year, but just 4,000 women every year from cervical cancer in the United States today, versus the measles, which killed, about 450 children every year before it was the vaccine for it became in widespread use. We really have failed our children if we are looking at, lost my train of thought, if we are not requiring a vaccine. So when we don't mandate vaccines, when we loosen up, then we just don't protect our children well enough. And my last example about how we really need to make sure we're protecting our children is my friend Laura's son, Ben. So Ben, at the age of 2, was diagnosed with leukemia. And he his mother is very conscientious, and he was treated for leukemia, and she brought him into the children's hospital regularly for his treatments. And one day she brought him to the children's hospital, and when she got home, she received a phone call from the hospital telling her that sitting alongside her in the waiting room was a child who was diagnosed with measles. And so her son needed to receive the immunoglobulin for measles, and then he was put on a 21-day quarantine. And she will tell you that 21-day quarantine was more stressful and more difficult for her than the original leukemia diagnosis. This is Laura speaking about how difficult it was. She said, "How could anyone ask Ben to fight more than leukemia? It is more than enough to ask children to fight leukemia, but to ask him to fight a vaccine-preventable disease on top of it, it's unconscionable." And so when it comes down to mandate or not to mandate, I sure wish we could just say vaccinate your kids and send them to school. I know there's a lot of pitfalls along the way in doing it, but I think no matter what we do, we have to remember children like Ben, children who were failed by our community efforts to protect them and who really rely on us and whose very lives depend on us protecting them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ernst. Families and parents are lucky to have you champion your case. For those of you, we'll be taking questions later through Twitter, so feel free to tweet your questions at #TalkFI. Now it brings me to my next special guest, no stranger here to the Philadelphia community, Dr. Paul Offit, Chief of Division of Infectious Diseases and the Director of the Vaccine Education Center at CHOP. He's also the Maurice Hilleman Professor of Vaccinology and Professor of Pediatrics at the Perelman School of Medicine here at the University of Pennsylvania. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Paul Offit.
Thank you, Dr. Bertley. So I'd like to sort of focus on maintaining that balance between parents' rights and children's rights. The CDC has recently looked at the percentage of parents who are choosing not to vaccinate, and they estimate that roughly 1 to 2% are choosing to give their children no vaccines, 10 to 20% are choosing to delay, withhold, separate, or space out vaccines, and not surprisingly, as more people are making that choice and community immunity or herd immunity erodes, one starts to see outbreaks. The reason that parents are making this choice is because they can. There are 3 ways in which that can happen. One is a medical exemption, which is to say if your child, for example, is allergic to a specific component, they obviously shouldn't be mandated to receive a vaccine. And the other 2 are so-called non-medical exemptions, which I would argue are misnamed. The most common, the religious exemption, which currently exists in 47 states, I think is misnamed because I think if you choose to put your child in harm's way in the name of religion, and thus others in harm's way in the name of religion, that's a profoundly unreligious thing to do, and therefore shouldn't be given the legal protections of religion. And the other term that's used is philosophical exemption. I think that too doesn't make much sense. Philo, love, sophos, wisdom. Where's the wisdom that says it's better not to get a vaccine than get one? So, as Karen alluded to, we saw an outbreak last year in 2015. We saw an outbreak that started in Southern California, spread to 25 states, involved about 180 people, mostly children. It also spread into 2 Canadian provinces involving hundreds of more children because people had made the choice to put their children in harm's way. Now, Karen also alluded to this, I think because that happened in California, because people in California got scared that measles now was suddenly knocking at their door, they then proposed this California Senate Bill SB 277 to eliminate their philosophical exemption. They actually didn't have a religious exemption, so this was to eliminate their philosophical exemption. The person who took the lead on that was a Democratic congressman from California named Richard Pan, here in the center, surrounded by women and their children who were supporting what he was trying to do. And not surprisingly, there was pushback because no one likes to have their rights taken away. No one likes to be told how to raise their family. Certainly no one likes to be told that they should be mandated to receive a vaccine when they don't think they should receive it. And so there was this pushback. This is a sign, and this is fairly typical. I mean, if you go to when these debates occur at places like Vermont or Michigan or California, the sign here is telling. Panicking, referring to Richard Pan, panicking over measles, get real. Where is the panic over 1 in 68 with autism? No on SB 277. Certainly, if measles-containing vaccine caused autism, then one certainly shouldn't mandate it. The issue is, however, that measles-containing vaccine doesn't cause autism, therefore this is a non-issue. Nor does it cause many of the other things that people claim have damaged their children, such as multiple sclerosis or diabetes or attention deficit disorder or hyperactivity disorder. So vaccines don't do that, therefore sort of using this as a reason for why you shouldn't get it isn't a good one. What was interesting about this, and this also is implied in Karen's last story, what happened in California, and I think this kind of fell into their laps, but it certainly changed the conversation, was this boy on the left. He stood up and said, I have leukemia. I mean, I can't be vaccinated. What about me? Don't I count? How about my rights? Don't I have rights too? And I think that really ultimately turned the tide on that discussion. And I guess I would make this the analogy to the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment states, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That's the so-called due process amendment, but it's the second one that I want to focus on. Nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection under the laws. That in other words, parents don't own their children. That when you own your car, but you don't own your child. I think when you have a child, you have a certain responsibility to put that children in the best possible condition, best possible position possible, the safest possible position. And so there's no reason, I think, why children whose parents don't embrace good medical care should be afforded less protection under the law than other children. So this is actually my last slide. I think I'd like to believe that in a better world, that what's happened in California represents a new norm. Certainly, since that bill has passed, there's been a dramatic increase in the incidence of people who are choosing to vaccinate their children. There were elementary schools in the Los Angeles area that had immunization rates of less than 50%. There were immunization rates worse than South Sudan in Southern California. And so what happened was what you saw happen, is that the virus spread. I think that the question for children, I think, is the reason I like this analogy to a civil rights movement is this. If you're an African American and you feel you're treated badly, there are groups who will represent you. If you're a woman and you feel you're not being paid equal for what was equal work to a man, there are groups who will represent you. If you're Jewish and you feel you're being defamed, there are groups who will represent you. But if you're a child, who represents you? Your parents represent you. And sometimes they don't represent you well. And when they don't represent you well, then what happens? And I think it's reasonable then for the state to step forward and compel people to vaccinate, as was what happened in California. Now there's an increase in immunization rates. I guess the analogy I'll make, and then I'll stop, is that in the 1950s, you could have talked till you were blue in the face about how African Americans should be treated equally to other people because they're human. They deserve, therefore, to be treated with humanity and respect. But that was only going to get you so far. And until that became law, then you basically created a new norm. So that now the president of the student body at the University of Mississippi is an African-American woman. I don't think anybody would have envisioned that 50 years ago. And I think ultimately here, I think this is a 14th Amendment issue that children also have the right to be protected under the law, even when their parents, because of either religious or philosophical beliefs, choose to put them in harm's way. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Offit. And so we're going to come back to that, and we're going to have a very interesting panel discussion here. But key to all of this is the inherent concept of risk. And it's my pleasure to introduce David Ropeik, who's risk and communication and management consultant, author, journalist, specializing in risk perception, and a former director of the risk communication at Harvard Center for Risk Analysis.
Well, I have a number of things to say, and I hope you'll let me not take them out of my 7 minutes. First of all, I grew up in Trenton, New Jersey, and I used to love to come to Philadelphia for the Phillies and tasty cakes. You can't get them in Massachusetts. I have literally sent away in the mail, but they only come a case at a time, and it's really bad for me. So it's wonderful to have this visit. Thank you very much. The second one is I want to commend this institution, as I was doing earlier in our conversation. This is a heated issue, and a lot of these discussions get really screamy and nasty, and Paul Offit has had death threats, and he's trying to represent the best interests of kids, and disagree with them all you want, but that's taking it too far. And this sort of forum that the Franklin Institute has created, first with GMOs and now this, and there'll be others, is the safe space where we can disagree or have our passions, but respectfully. And reaching decisions about stuff like this needs a space like that. So it's super to be a part of helping create this institution. Third of all, thank you for being here on a snowy night. I was once asked to give a talk to the whole nation of Cyprus, new public health institute that Harvard had joined with. And it turned out that that night was the finals of the soccer match that the nation of Cyprus was in against somebody. And there was nobody there. So you guys are all heroes. And finally, I have no conflicts of interest. And that needs to be said. I've never been paid a penny by anybody with any interest in this issue at all. I'm a former journalist who saw when I was doing stories constantly, no matter what the story was about, if there was any risk in it, there were people who were more afraid than the experts said they really needed to be. Here's what the evidence says. And there were people on the same risk or on other stories who weren't as afraid as they ought to be, according to what the experts said. And that was so ubiquitous that I thought to myself, wow, this is built into the human animal. This must have been studied. I wonder if it had been. And it turns out it had been. That there's a robust 40 or 50-year-old body of evidence on the psychology of risk perception that explains why people can truly believe there's 1 in 68 people who have autism, despite what the evidence says, and why we all can believe different things about the same sets of facts on tons of things. This is really only an example of the phenomenon. So my interest in it now is as a proselytizer of what those researchers, smarter people than me, have found out, and I've written about and speak about how understanding the psychology of risk perception speaks to how a community struggles with these conflicts in society's rights versus a parent's rights. So let me sum up for you there's a background point that I didn't hear made by the early two speakers. Paul alluded to it a little bit. It's very important to establish that nationally, childhood vaccination rates are fine. And you saw it in the CDC numbers, 1 or 2% low. But national is not the right way to keep score. The research on this finds that the under-vaccination rates, below herd immunity, you all know what herd immunity is. Enough of us are sick so that if one person gets sick, it bumps into vaccinated people and it can't spread. How'd I do? Is that okay? Close? Like I say, I try to defer to people who really know what they're talking about as often as I need to as a careful journalist. So it's only in isolated communities where the herd immunity rate gets low. These outbreaks that you hear about are in fact not ubiquitous across America. They are in geographic pockets. Small, thank goodness, actually, for the health of our communities. But there's something that's common to those pockets, and that's what I'm here to offer some insight about. There are 3 basic themes that you hear from the parents in those communities about why they are either reluctant, hesitant, they're called vaccine hesitant, to follow the full prescription schedule, which, by the way, has been medically tested so that it maximizes efficacy for the kid. That's why that schedule's there. It's not handier for the nurse to not have to do it twice. It's medically efficacious, but they're hesitant, or they absolutely refuse. So there's both of those versions. And by the way, even in those communities, it's important to recognize that there are lots of other parents who are nervous about vaccinating, but just because it's in the interest of their kids. They don't speak about this issue in what I will now describe as a values sort of way of seeing the facts. There are 3 values voices that come up commonly across the country in the communities that have hesitancy or refusal. They are, first, and these will sound familiar to you, I don't want to give my kids something that's not natural. Right? We hear that all the time. Vaccines, it turns out, are based on natural substances, but they are human-made. And there are just people who are suspicious and worrisome about human-made stuff. Now, it turns out that the psychology of risk perception finds that that's true of all of us on lots of things. That's right. Natural is less scary than man-made. It's interesting that in the communities where that's the loudest voice, these are particularly, as Seth Mnookin, who's written on this, says, find me a community with a lot of Whole Food stores and Priuses, and I can find you people who say this. Right? I'm not disparaging, but this is a characteristic of the value set of people who live amongst themselves. I live in Concord, Massachusetts. I happen to be a Prius-laden, Whole Food living guy, right? And it's true. I mean, I can't have this conversation with a lot of my friends at my Unitarian, Universalist, liberal, let's think about things, vaccines will kill my baby church, and stay friends with them. So I don't. But it's true. So there's a value set. It's interesting when I have this conversation with my friends, and the research literature says this, there are people who are concerned about man-made things, who are not only concerned about vaccines, but are concerned about nuclear power because of the carcinogenic radiation that comes from that, who let their kids go out and play in the sun with no sunscreen protection from the carcinogenic radiation from the sun, which is natural. This is not stupid or irrational or wrong. This is just, I hear your chuckles. This is what built into all of us. This is the intrinsic subconscious feeling way we sort these sorts of things out. Two other values areas that I want to get to, and then I want to get to this opt-out question and how we use our values insights to think that through. The second value, and you've heard this a lot, is libertarian. I don't like the government telling me what to do to my kid. And doesn't that resonate to all of us? Doesn't it feel right that the ultimate arbiter of my child's safety is me, the parent? Who are you to tell me I'm wrong, I'm bad? You know, that's a feeling thing. Now, I see and agree with your point, Paul, but you can see that libertarian feeling, government butting into my life too much, theme represented in thou shalt. The government telling you thou shalt about nothing short of the safety of your child. This is thou shalt immunize your dog. Your dog and your kid are two different things. The analogy doesn't completely hold because of the values part of it, the emotion part of it, right? And by the way, again, I live in super liberal Concord, Massachusetts. We all agree that the government's butting into our lives too much in this way or that. Maybe not vaccines. I could get you all to raise your hand that there's some way that the government's a pain in the butt in your lives. So this is resonant to all of us. My point is, vaccines, we're talking about vaccines specifically, but I'm here talking about that it's built into all of us to feel this way on various issues. I'm encouraging you to give some respect to the underlying roots of where these values come from. That's not to say how society should solve the problem. I'll get there. The third common theme is a lack of trust. Lack of trust first in the pharmaceutical industry, because whose side are they on? Not yours. Not mine. Sorry, you're part of it. Not, you're a doctor. You're on the patient side. But we perceive that companies are on their side. That's what the law says. Their side. And the psychology of the study of trust finds that we are exquisitely sensitive to whose side people are on. And that's the trust barometer. And this is because we're social animals. We've evolved to depend on each other for survival. If the gunman or the lion, let's not do gunman, right? If the lion walks in here now and we all fight him off, some of us survive. If I've made you all angry and you're disagreeing with me, you feed me to the lion and you're all out of here safe. Social rejection is really dangerous. So we're sensitive to who's on our side and who agrees with us. Our tribal views keep us safe amongst our friends. And so we're sensitive to whose side our friends are on through their views and their actions and their values. And companies aren't on our side, they're on their own. Monsanto and you name a long list, right? Now, we're also mistrustful of the doctors in the medical community who support those companies. Conflict of interest and all that sort of stuff that Paul has to put up with. It's nonsense, but it's trust. Whose side are they on? They're on the side of those big bad companies. And that raises this important point for all of you who are trying to sort this out or think this through on behalf of your communities. We do trust our individual pediatricians and doctors, because whose side are they on? We feel very much more that they are on our side. The way people talk to you in your clinical practice, I dare say, is probably a little bit more intimate and respectful, trustful of you, Paul, than that kind of big outside, corporate bad guy. Trust is the third theme. Natural, libertarian, and trust. Now, let me get to the final topic of the hour. How do we put this into the context of, do we mandate the opting out part? There's something else to remember. There's another value here. This is a conflict of values. The vaccine issue is how we see the facts through the lenses of how we feel about those facts, which, by the way, is true of every single perception in our entire lives. Our spouses, our sports teams, our junk food, our tasty cakes. I've had friends who I've tried to talk into loving tasty cakes who don't. I don't understand that. I shouldn't mandate tasty cakes on them, but it's through their own lenses that they're seeing how tasty cakes are. Our perceptions are ultimately entirely subjective. That's the human cognition truth. Everything is subjective. This is just one example. So how does society deal with the people who have its man-made, libertarian, lack of trust values against the value that we all buy into as citizens? We buy into the fact that we are sharing in a community a basic sense of common good. What do we do to people who drive drunk? I wanna. I'm a good driver. I just had the 3 extra beers. To hell with everybody else. I'm going to drive home. What do we do with people who are texting on the phone? What do we do with people who grind up apricot pits and peach pits and call it Laetrile and say it's natural, it's a cure for cancer? What do we do with people who say natural, unpasteurized milk is better, so I'm going to illegally sell unpasteurized milk? We ban that. We say that the value of the greater society trumps that. Because, in general, when we're doing things in the name of the greater common good, we all individually benefit from that on net. So now we have 3 individual values, the natural, the trust, the libertarian thing, against the value that we all buy into, including those parents, of the greater common good. How do we balance that with the opting out program? So here's my prescription. I've written about this. It's a proposal. It's a suggestion. It's a way of thinking about this. I don't think society should absolutely preclude opting out the way SB 7277 did. And I wrote Dr. Pan about this when he was promoting his campaign and wrote an op-ed in the Los Angeles Times. But I do agree that we need to make opting out, as it's called, way harder. Because right now, you know what you have to do to have a philosophical exemption? Does anyone know? You sign a piece of paper. I got it. Done. Easy. There are actually studies by Doug Oppel and Saad Omer who have found that, I think it was in the state of Washington where they have to sign more paperwork. It was some state, I forget where. They just raised how many pieces of paper they had to sign. The number of people opting out went down just because more pieces of paper. I think we need to make opting out harder. And here's specifically what I mean. If any of us have a values-based philosophical exemption to society telling us what to do or not to do, we should believe, if we want to not be mandated for the greater common good, we should be able to defend that values-based feeling. So, somebody has a philosophical exemption because it's not man-made, because it is human-made, excuse me. You should be able to defend with evidence about what you eat and what medicines you take and how you live your life, and with a full essay why that's the value by which you live. Fine. Okay? You should have that out. And you should have to, there should be a lot of hurdles. You want to establish that? That's fine. If you have a religious exemption, which in this case in the United States, as best I know, and I checked this with Paul earlier, is only Christian Science against Western medicine, you should have to have a note from your faith leader. You should have to have an explanation. You should have to have a conversation with the local community board of health and the school committee people. Here's what Christian Science says. And by the way, you need to be able to prove that that's how you live. Let me give you an example. There were 2 parents in Massachusetts who, back during my TV reporting days, were prosecuted for manslaughter because they let their son die who had a stomach blockage that could have saved his life with an operation, and they didn't allow him to have the operation because it was Western medicine and were Christian scientists. And it turned out in the evidence that they had had Western medicine for their own infirmities but wouldn't allow it for their son. Send them to jail. So, you believe that religiously? Prove it to me. Now, here's what that does. Oh, by the way, there's one other thing. You don't get to philosophically opt out because you disagree with what the body of the science says. You don't get to say it causes autism. You don't get to say thimerosal. You don't get to say all those things because local school boards and boards of health don't have the expertise to sort out all the stuff that 150 years of epidemiology has overwhelmingly told us about the net benefit of these diseases, and that autism and so forth has been discounted. You can believe that all you want. That one doesn't count. I mean, there are people who don't believe in evolution. That one doesn't count. Okay? So, how does this help? It helps in 2 ways, and then I'll be done. It helps first with the main medical goal of reducing the likelihood of these outbreaks. Correct me if I'm wrong, Paul and Karen, but we don't have any community, even where everybody's having 100% of all their shots, where the vaccine is 100% effective in everybody, right? There's a here and there person who it wasn't effective in, or it wore out, depending on the actual vaccine. So at any given time in a perfectly everybody inoculated from everything community, there's some people running around who are effectively not vaccinated. But you have more than herd immunity. And as I alluded to earlier, the harder you make opting out, the lower you get to the opting out level. And finally, I would suggest with this, you would get above herd immunity in most places. I'm not being perfect about this. But the second important thing is, and this is my closing point, this is a battle of values. We use the facts as weapons to manifest our values about natural and libertarian versus the common good and the children and the 14th Amendment. Showing the people who have the natural and libertarian and trust values question the tiny loophole that's respect for their feeling is a statement that your feelings are valid, not stupid, not wrong, not irrational, not you dummy, why don't you get the facts? You can argue the facts, but saying that puts them off. Saying I respect them, if you really prove it, you've got the loophole, builds trust and diffuses some of the values conflict as we try to get to fewer of these communities having outbreaks. Thanks.
No, we are good. Thank you very much. I'm David Ropeik. That was fantastic. All right, ladies and gentlemen, please come on up. All right. So that was definitely a spirited conclusion to the monologues. I want to pick up with something you left off, David, and I want to float this to Dr. Offit first. Real quick, for the audience, what is herd immunity? Because I think you talked about it's a value system, and you talked about the common good. Well, describe what herd immunity is and how that can actually speak to the common good and how that may solve one of the issues.
So herd immunity is that you can vaccinate a high enough percentage of the population that you essentially stop the spread of that virus or bacteria. It doesn't have to be 100%, but the degree that is required depends on the contagiousness of the pathogen. So when you start to see an erosion of herd immunity, what you see come back are the most contagious disease coming back first, and that's what you're seeing now: measles, mumps, whooping cough. You would have to erode herd immunity further to start to see things like polio or diphtheria come back. So it's just community immunity. You can actually immunize enough of the community that you can protect those who aren't immunized, which is good because there are about 500,000 people in this population of 314 million people who can't be vaccinated. Can't be vaccinated because they're getting chemotherapy for their cancers or immune suppressive therapy for their chronic diseases or immune suppressive therapy for their asthma. So they depend on those around them to protect them.
And let me add one thing, Paul, and correct me if I'm wrong. Herd immunity the number for herd immunity is unique not only based on the spreadability of the contagiousness of the disease, but the efficacy of the vaccine. So both of those go into how high a level do you have to get to so that the disease bumps into mostly vaccinated people.
That's right.
And the efficacy of the vaccine is another one. So there are a lot of vaccines that kids get, and the number's different.
Sure. Now, David, if we get to that number, whatever it is, within that spectrum of difference, and you achieve herd immunity, doesn't that speak to the common good? Is that not a solid argument? Because you spoke about the common good drives many of us, etc.
Well, let me take one side, and I would encourage Paul to take the other. So let me put it this way, rather. I'll take both sides, yes and no. Right? So if we have herd immunity, but the leukemic kid is in the school in California, he's not covered. So that's the no. And the yes is the general common good is respected. So that's a values-based question. If the leukemic kid is mine, no. If I'm in a general community where you don't have that unique circumstance, yes.
Where is the leukemic kid getting the infection if herd immunity actually exists?
From the one kid who isn't vaccinated because he got the loophole that Dave suggested.
Or from, you take a vaccine like measles. Measles is an excellent vaccine. The measles vaccine is excellent. It'll protect about 95% of those who are immunized, but 5 of 100 won't be protected. So immunization doesn't protect everybody. So which is to say, he may also get it from the child who was vaccinated, but who wasn't protected.
Sure.
And by the way, the leukemic kid gives me an opportunity to add one thought that I wanted to, and it's the Disneyland thought. The Disneyland outbreak is nowhere near the worst measles outbreak this country has had in the last few years. What was it, New York one, 3,000? There are a lot of bigger numbers. It happened in Happy Land. Yeah. It happened in a symbolic, bad things aren't supposed to happen to kids here land. It got on TV more because of that. and we were off to the races. And then we started to have what happens with all risks, the risk-benefit seesaw starts to go the other way. So we've heard people, and Paul's quoted them, and he's absolutely right, why should I take a tiny chance of vaccinating my kid for no benefit? The disease is gone. Well, it's not. When it comes back, and we're aware of it, that goes the other way, and we hear the leukemic kids, and the fear of the disease outweighs the fear of the vaccine. And that's what the Disneyland outbreak uniquely did because of those unique emotional characteristics. Excuse me.
Yeah, let me just underline one other thing. So that's right. I mean, so last year's outbreak involved about 180 children over 25 states. That was less than 1/3 of the previous year's outbreak. The previous year's outbreak was 680 children, and you never heard about it. Why did you never hear about it? Because it occurred basically in an Amish community in Medina County, Ohio, and who cares, right? I'm not going to Ohio, I'm good. But the minute it happened in Disneyland, where, a shared space, a commons, then it mattered, which is to say, although we say we care about America's children, what we really mean to say is we care about our children. We should have cared just as much about those Amish children as we care about these children. So I don't buy the notion that the 680 gets grandfathered in, which is basically what happened.
Sure. All right, I want to change gears here. Karen, as someone that speaks very closely to parents, and David, you talked about this whole idea of staggering might be a way to go, but absolutely not, because this has been scientifically calculated. Medicine has really preached to why the schedule is what it is. Can you talk about what parents are saying about that and the idea of could we stagger it, despite the fact that the data suggests no?
So, the question is, can I conjure up my own vaccine schedule? So when we look at how the vaccine schedule is made, we have experts from all over the country who are a part of an independent committee, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. They're not CDC employees. They come together. They look at all of the research based on when are vaccines given, when are they the most effective, when are children the most at risk, and when is there the least possibility of side effects. And then we design a vaccine schedule around that. But some people still feel uncomfortable around experts designing this vaccine schedule, and they think, well, what if I did it this way, or I bought this book, and this book gave me this other way of having a vaccine schedule, or what if I spaced them out a little bit, what if I made my own? Sort of the self-expertise, I know my child, I'm going to do the vaccine schedule my own way. Now, I would never, the answer I'm going to give isn't going to be about what should a pediatrician do with his patients, because I think that patient-pediatrician conversation can be a lot more dicier than the conversation we're having today. But we really should not entertain alternate vaccine schedules. There's no reason for them. All they do is increase risk. They do nothing to mitigate the side effects of vaccines. In fact, sometimes if you take something like an MMR vaccine and you delay it a little bit, the side effects can actually be worse. There's more chance of fever and of febrile seizures. So the simple answer is no. We shouldn't entertain alternate vaccine schedules, and we really should very clearly state to parents that the vaccine schedule is safe. The vaccine schedule is tested. Vaccines are studied along with other vaccines. We know that the schedule works, and it's there for a reason, and there really isn't any reason at all to have an alternate schedule.
Sure.
There's one other point again, forgive me for adding. There's another point, correct me too, Paul, if I'm wrong, but the schedule is designed to maximize protection of the child. So if your kid can be vaccinated at age 3, but you wait to age 4, and there's no side effect from doing it at age 3, there's a year when he wasn't protected.
Right.
It's designed to be optimally protected the kid as soon as is safe and healthy for them.
Sure.
Yeah,
So one of the points you brought up, David, is this whole idea of perception, and I think that drives a lot of people's kind of trepidation with going with vaccines. So understand the science, understand the medicine, understand that risk from year 3 to year 4, but there's still a perception that you're getting jammed all these vaccines at once. Can you speak to that perception, and how can we help educate around that so that it's...
So there are other elements from the Psychology of Risk Perception study of Paul Slovic and Baruch Fischoff and the people from whom I've learned that speak to that. One of them is called uncertainty. That's what the academics call it. Basically, it means the more complicated it is, the less I feel like I know, and if I don't know what I need to know, I don't feel powerful to know what I need to know to protect myself. So the synergies and what is it, 64 vaccines that kids get, and all these things that people invoke, what I hear in their comments is an unknowingness, an uncertaintiness. And uncertainty about any risk makes it scarier. So terrorists might attack. It's scary not because it's really likely, but we don't know who, where, when, what, whatever. And when they attack in America, all of a sudden it can happen to me. And the me factor on top of the uncertainty makes that way scarier than statistically it ought to be. So that's one of them. The second one is a different version of uncertainty. You guys know all this science. I don't. People can be Google Docs. I love that phrase, Google Docs. We all go on Google and now we're doctors, right? And kind of look it up, but I know I don't have the expertise to really sort this out. So when you start talking about synergies and thimerosal and all these other things that get thrown in, the complications of the schedule add to that lack of expertise, leaving people precautionary and risk averse against it as a way to protect themselves.
You know, I think that's true sometimes. I really want to emphasize, though, I think it's something 95% of parents do vaccinate on schedule. And that's important because we spend a lot of time talking about our parents afraid that we're giving too many vaccines. And I think the simple answer to that is no. I think parents go in and the doctors say, here are the vaccines that are due. And it doesn't feel like a lot of vaccines for most parents. You know, once the first shot goes in and the baby's crying, the next two really don't make that much of a difference. You know, the baby's still crying and then we're done. And you know, come back in 2 months. I think a lot of parents are more than happy to come back in 2 months because they like seeing their doctors because is my baby still okay? You know, we're worried as new parents. I don't think it feels like too much for most parents. I think that's sort of one of those things that gets put out there in hopes of making parents feel like it's too much. But I think most parents don't bite on that.
Sure.
You know, I completely agree, although it's probably the most, of those who are sort of concerned about vaccines, that's probably the most common concern, which is not surprising. I mean, we ask parents in this country to give vaccines to prevent 14 different diseases in the first few years of life. That during that time can mean as many as 26 inoculations. It can mean as many as 5 shots at one time to prevent diseases that most people don't see using biological fluids most people don't understand. It's not surprising that there's pushback. I mean, I give credit to Bob Sears when he put out his book, The Vaccine Book, and had Dr. Bob's alternative vaccine schedule at the back, because alternative's a good word, right? I mean, alternative energy, alternative music. There's nothing alternative about the vaccine schedule. There's an alternative rabies vaccine schedule. There actually are 2 rabies vaccine schedules. That's it. There's a delayed vaccine schedule, as David alluded to. I mean, you're given vaccines at 2, 4, and 6 months of age because diseases like rotavirus, pneumococcus, Haemophilus influenza type B occur in that 6-month to 24-month age group. So you want to make sure you're vaccinated then. To delay that, to really delay that, is to put your child at unnecessary risk. And there's not a year that goes by at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia where we do not see a child hospitalized and occasionally killed by a vaccine-preventable disease that was preventable, but that parents chose not to vaccinate them. It's, you know, it's hard to watch that. And I think for that reason, I think I've come to the conclusion that I have zero tolerance on this, because if there's one child whose parent is say, you know, motivated enough to fill out all the forms or get these things signed, and their child is hurt, that's too many.
Well, I think this is a great place to, I really want to take the questions from the audience, and there are a lot coming in here on my screen. I just want to take a poll here because today's discussion is about to mandate or not. So starting first with you, David. I mean, I heard you loud and clear. Make it more stringent, but just say on record.
The opt-out mandate or mandate vaccines? Mandate vaccines leave a tiny, tiny, really high hurdle loophole on mandating and not allowing opting out. That's my vote.
Okay.
Eliminate all non-medical exemptions.
So I would love to eliminate all non-medical exemptions. I don't think it's always feasible. I think we have to make vaccine legislation as tight as possible. If possible, we eliminate those non-medical exemptions, but if not, we make it hard to get them. I think it's simpler just to mandate.
Okay. And how do you control the audience that actually reviews this? I mean, if you think about the scientific or medical level of expertise that some of these law writers and lawmakers and people making decisions, I mean, what's the professional development? What's the training going to look like to have these people be able to say, okay, that's a valid mandate, that's not a mandate? What does that look like?
Professional training?
Dare I say it in this instance?
Well, it's a political question. It's a values question. It's a democracy deciding sort of question. It's the fight between the scream fest. It's why all of the noise that we're glad that we have this thoughtful discussion instead is, against which is the noise. It's a passion play, as is all of decision-making in a democracy. Hold your nose and vote, kind of.
Lawmakers will tell you that 20 years ago, the people who used to come to them and get their opinions expressed were people who sort of were in the mainstream. Oh, we want clean water. We'd like vaccines to be more accessible. That's no longer true. Now the people that lawmakers hear from are the people who are in the tiny minority. And so it's very, very difficult for a lawmaker to cut through the noise and really understand that what they're hearing isn't what's coming from the majority of their constituency. And in addition to that, most people who are vaccinating their kids are really unaware of the risk posed to their children and their community by those who don't vaccinate. And they end up not being motivated in contacting their lawmakers. And so that's really where educating lawmakers comes from. They hear a lot of noise from the other side, the side that thinks that vaccines are dangerous and unnecessary, and they don't hear a lot from people who believe the science.
Frederic, excuse me, I'm butting in a lot, but there's an additional answer to that. So I do trainings for legislators on how to handle risk issues where they're hearing from the tiny, screamy, loud side. And what I suggest to them, and some of them have said they've tried, this is with GMOs, though not vaccines, so they're all unique issues with different sets of passions and so forth. But what I recommend to them is have 2 hearings. Today we're going to have the feelings hearing, or you start with the facts hearing. We're going to have all the experts come in and tell us what the facts are. And anybody who stands up and says, I don't trust pharmaceutical companies, or it's natural or man-made, or all these libertarian values, you're going to have a voice tomorrow. Not your turn. Sit down. They separate the two, they try to partially separate the fact-finding reason part, because we also reason, right? We're not just instinctive feeling slaves to our passions. We also use the fact. I've advised them, and some of them said it kind of works a little bit in Vermont and New Hampshire and some pretty interesting agricultural states to separate those two. The other thing I tell legislators is, think about how loud they're going to get if this goes against you, and you hear from the leukemic kid side and the side that showed up after the seesaw flipped with Disneyland. Put yourself in those political shoes and think about that too. Change the side that's going to be the loud one calling you so that they can envision the politics of that. And I'm told by a handful of them in Massachusetts that opens their thinking.
Great. First question from the audience. It's a great one. Are there different views on mandates among different socioeconomic groups? Is this a class thing? Is this a
Here's what I would say. I mean, if you look at who chooses not to vaccinate, it's generally an upper middle class to upper class group, generally Caucasian, invariably college educated, often graduate school educated, who often have jobs in which they are either professionals or at least making decisions, who believe basically that they can get the information they need they will know more than anyone who's giving them advice. That's the group. I mean, the Hispanic population in Philadelphia gets vaccinated. They actually believe that doctors are trying to make the best decisions for them and that public health officials are not against them. They actually believe those people want to help them, so they actually just get vaccines. So so I think there are different groups. I mean, I think that generally so those who have less are much more willing to be vaccinated.
Dealing with parents as well, you see the same thing, Karen?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this tends to be an upper class issue. I do, it's interesting because I come from a state where our largest group of vaccine hesitancy is actually among a relatively new immigrant population and so our measles outbreak that affected Ben, who had leukemia, spread through a homeless shelter and the ER at the Children's Hospital. So it can vary, but it, generally speaking, is white, wealthy, and well-educated.
And with one addition, I can cite a few off the top of my head that, having read about this and followed it, are pockets of a libertarian kind of government but out of my life sorts of folks. But the short answer to the question is yes, there are demographic uniquenesses and isolated pockets where those become prominent within a community where the numbers get high enough. It's not a ubiquitous thing.
Great. All right. This is a good one from Twitter. And I'm not sure if it's true, but here's the question. Can someone speak to the lack of independent oversight and how that may enhance public confidence?
I guess I'm having trouble buying into the premise of the question,
I agree.
that there's a lack of independent oversight.
So let's come at it differently. Can you identify or explain for the audience the independent oversight?
All right, so I mean, here's how it works. A vaccine is tested in phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials. The phase 3 trials invariably involve tens of thousands of children studied prospectively to see whether the vaccine works and whether it's safe. If it works and it's safe, then it's licensed by the Food and Drug Administration. Then it goes to two major groups. One is the so-called Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices, the CDC. The other is the Committee of Infectious Diseases for the American Academy of Pediatrics, who looks through all those data, who reads through all those papers that one needs to read through, learning everything about the disease and the vaccine, and then they take it the next step. They make a recommendation for a particular group of children in this country. Then what happens is the vaccine now is licensed and recommended, and then it goes out into the world. And there's this is the best part. There's the so-called vaccine safety data link. So very quickly you'll know who's getting vaccinated and who's not. And it's a linked, computerized records of about 6% of the United States population. You'll know who's getting vaccinated and who's not. And so very quickly you'll find out whether or not there's a problem. I mean, it's too bad this isn't on the drug side. It's too bad there's not a drug safety data link, because I think you would have found out that Vioxx was a problem as a cause of heart disease much quicker than had it been a vaccine. So that's all independent. I mean, it's academicians in various universities looking through the data, trying to figure out whether or not this vaccine is what it's claimed to be, both pre-licensure and post-licensure. So it's exactly what you want it to be. I mean, I know we like to sort of put these people, it's like the vilify pharmaceutical companies as this monolithic distant body, and the Food and Drug Administration and the CDC, but you can't vilify every sort of university-associated, academic and public health official that's involved in this. And those people, by the way, are also parents who give the vaccines to their own children. So it's hard to buy into the conspiracy.
There's also, and I don't know whether it's in that last thing you mentioned, but Karen spoke about it, but as its acronym, VAERS. She said VAERS. Okay, no problem. The Vaccine Adverse Effect Reporting System. Events Reporting System. So it's this totally network that everybody, not just in the industry or the government, is all connected to. If anybody has a side effect out there, the lights go off. I mean, it's super, super, super watched. And guess what? They get to sue. There's a whole court set up for this. You got to really prove that the vaccine did it. And so far, I don't think anybody has, or very few have. But there's a whole court to oversee this in law too.
Here's what I was
saying. There's oversight.
The problem with, we're not taking questions from the audience, sorry. Just write your question down and then
make sure
pass it to the front and we'll get it. The Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System is at best, I guess you would argue, it's a hypothesis generating system. It's not a hypothesis testing system. Only the Vaccine Safety Data Link can do that. So there's a lot of noise in the VAERS system, which is just background noise. But at best, it's hypothesis generating. When the Rota-Shield vaccine was found to be a cause of intestinal blockage in 1998, it was VAERS actually that first sounded the warning, and then it was the Vaccine Safety Data Link that ultimately determined whether or not it really was a problem.
But lots of layers of oversight.
Okay, so fair enough. So a couple questions here. One, why is that the case for vaccines, and which is good, but not the case for drugs like Vioxx? A, and B,
or supplements.
Or supplements, and B, more supplements. And B, if you're a parent and your child's sick and you take your child to the doctor and you get a prescription for your child, and you don't give your child that, you don't fill out the prescription and give your child the drug, what are the consequences there? If you've sought medical help, the doctor gave you a prescription for your child, you didn't bother to fill it out, you didn't give it to your child may have got further sick, heaven forbid your child died.
It's worse than that. I mean, in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, we have a religious exemption to child abuse and neglect laws, including medical neglect. I mean, you saw anybody you guys are from Philadelphia, you know that if you followed the case of Brandon and Kent Scheibel, you know that a couple years ago there's a faith healing group in the city, Faith Tabernacle and First Century Gospel. There's two big faith healing churches. They chose prayer instead of antibiotics for their son's bacterial pneumonia, Kent, and he died at 2 years of age. They were put on probation. That's the way it works in the United States. Basically, your first child's free. Then the 7-month-old gets bacterial pneumonia. Also, they choose prayer instead of antibiotics. He also dies, and then they go to jail. So it's worse than that. I mean, we have a respect for what we call religion. I would argue that when they put their child in harm's way in the name of God, that was a distinctly unreligious thing to do. But there wasn't, even then, there was nothing in place to protect those other children. This doesn't happen in other countries. It doesn't happen in Canada. It doesn't happen in England. It happens here because for our quote-unquote respect for religion. I mean, I'm saying one should have respect for religion. I'm arguing these aren't religious things to do.
And just to answer the question very simply, when we give vaccines, we give them to children who are well, and we do it to prevent disease. When we give other drugs, we give them to children who are sick to make them better. And so because we're giving vaccines to children who are well, and because we're giving them to all children, we oversee them a lot more stringently. But I do want to say that if supplements and vitamins were given the same amount of oversight, I don't think there would be a single one for sale in any pharmacy in the world.
She's absolutely right. I completely agree with that. I mean, it's not only that they don't meet a safety and efficacy standard, they don't meet a labeling standard, which is to say that what's on the labels actually was in the bottle. And we're perfectly happy to do this. I mean,
can you speak to
and the risk perception literature explains both. First of all, the supplements are natural. So if you and I went camping, and the two of us, and our backs hurt, and we sat against a willow tree, and we chewed on the bark, and we discovered that our backs didn't hurt in the morning, we could grind up the willow bark and call it Paul and Dave's Magic Pain Away dust with rainbows and crystals on it and sell it in your local natural whatever store tomorrow. And the only way it could be pulled from the market as injurious is if you could bring me all the bodies that it caused, deaths, and absolutely proves not association but causation. Extraordinarily different standard. If, on the other hand, we said, there might be some active molecule in here, and we did the research and discovered it was salicylic acid, aspirin, it would be 10 years and a decade and $1 billion worth of research under the other rules to do precisely the same thing because that's human-made. Natural gets less regulation because we're not afraid of regulation. We don't ask the government to protect us from things we're not afraid of. But we do ask them to protect us from things we're super afraid of, which top of the list is kids. So you asked the first part of your question, why vaccines and not the other drugs? And what are we talking about? We're not talking about flu vaccine. We're not supposed to have interplay here. But raise your hand if you've had your flu shot. Let's do it the other way. Raise your hand if you haven't had your flu shot. Well, why are we talking about that? Because the hot button issue is having to do with kids. That's why we overprotect. There are rules in this country that every school has to be tested for asbestos. Not other buildings. I don't know about this one. I won't talk about that until you leave. Not workplaces, not homes, kids. Super high fear, super more demand for more protection.
So here's a question then for all you three. It's a very important question. Someone in the audience, what do you say to the parents who do have a vaccine-injured child? So let's assume that was definitive, that the child was injured.
What's the injury?
Yeah, because vaccines don't cause autism.
Fair enough. So I'm setting up the question here.
I'm just saying, usually when that question's asked, I always say it's important to note that vaccines do not cause autism.
So that's the direct answer?
That's usually the answer.
Well, can I ask a question on behalf of that person? What do you say to the person, doctor, who comes in with a side effect that is super, 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 super rare, but on the list of possibly vaccines might cause them, because there are those. They're super, 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 super rare, and the benefits far outweigh the harms. But they occasionally show up. What do you say to them?
All right, so let's just for the purpose of education, let's go through what are the side effects of vaccines. Do vaccines have side effects? Yes. Can those vaccine side effects be severe? Yes. So what are they? The most common is an allergic reaction to a component in the vaccine. Gelatin egg proteins. That occurs in roughly 1 per 1.3 million doses. That's a preventable side effect, which is to say that when it occurs, that's why you stay in the doctor's office for 15 minutes. It'll occur immediately. It's a so-called type 1 or immediate type hypersensitivity reaction. And although it can cause not just hives, but shock and death, if you're there for 15 minutes, it's not going to happen because that's why doctors have epinephrine in their offices. That's the most common serious vaccine adverse event. There are others. Measles-containing vaccine can cause a lowering of the platelet count, which can cause this sort of, looks like a little rash. It's transient. It's not permanent. We occasionally see that in the hospital, but that's real. Occurs in roughly 1 in 30,000 doses. The yellow fever vaccine, which was first invented in the 1930s, can cause systemic disease, meaning overwhelming disease, meaning death in people over 65 years of age. There's been 55 cases of death from yellow fever vaccine since the 1930s. So a lot of doses that are given, but that's why that vaccine is not listed as a contraindication for the greater than 65-year-old. The oral polio vaccine, which we used in this country up until about 1999, could itself cause polio. It occurred in 1 per 2.4 million doses. That was a real side effect, and we certainly saw that in the hospital. We eliminated polio from this country by the late 70s, meaning natural polio, but we didn't eliminate polio caused by the vaccine, and every year 6 to 8 children would be paralyzed by that vaccine. Some would be killed by that vaccine, and that's why we eliminated that vaccine from this country and went back to the inactivated polio vaccine. The Pandemrix vaccine, which was a squalene adjuvanted influenza vaccine that was used in Europe and Scandinavia, not here, could cause narcolepsy, which was a disorder of wakefulness, any permanent disorder of wakefulness, depending on the country, between 1 in 15,000 and 1 in 50,000 people. That was because it's a technical issue, but that too is completely avoidable by just making sure there's not influenza nucleoprotein in the vaccine. That's it. That's it. So when people say vaccine damage, if they mean one of those things, then I get it. But that's never what they mean. What they mean invariably is autism or hyperactivity or multiple sclerosis or diabetes or some sort of neurological disorder. That's what they mean. So let's just define terms.
So back to the perception point. Hear you. How do we get the larger audience to understand that? And I mean, obviously, education plays a role, but what else can be done? Because, I mean, you were categorical about the list that are there, and that's evidence.
I'm going to be honest with you. Here's how you can. I mean, we created the Vaccine Education Center 15 years ago. I think we try. We try to get good information out there, but nothing educated like measles. I mean, the reason that SB 277 exists is because there was a measles outbreak that started in California. The virus did the education. I mean, we respond, and David knows this much better than I do. We are hardwired for fear. We're just basically hardwired to run away from animals larger than ourselves. I think the cerebrum came late to the game. So I think you can do all the education you want, and the fact of the matter is, until you compel people to do the right thing, there are going to be a group of people that are never going to do the right thing, no matter how rational and compelling and passionate and compassionate you are. It's never going to happen. And it's happening in California now because we're forcing it. I feel the same way about this sort of civil rights issue in Mississippi. Until you went down there with the troops, no one was going to integrate.
Well, what changed in California is the fear of the disease now is outweighing the fear of the vaccine. But it's fear, it's not education.
Right.
This is a very important point for all of you people who braved the snow, have some interest in really understanding things and thinking things through, and some passion on the issue, whatever it is, that's fine. But you're engaged. You're intellectually engaged. But mostly your brain is in charge of one job from the moment you wake up, which is getting your genes safely to bed at night. It's not figuring stuff out. So there is this concept, and what I make my living in is consulting in risk communication. I've actually studied what efforts have been made to do this with vaccines and can speak to that specifically. The theory in risk communication is you have to speak to and respect people's feelings and values, and then you offer them your facts, and it may resonate more with their reasoning side of their brain than otherwise would if you say, here's what I want you to think and how I want you to feel. That's the implicit message. Here are my facts means you shall feel the way I feel. Don't do that. Show respect for the emotions, even if you disagree, and then give the facts and try to build trust. But the other way to do it is to try and talk to the values in a way that's consistent with the values that are energizing their view of the facts. So here's one experiment on by the way, let me back up. The model that doesn't work is what's called the deficit model, which is I'll educate them. I'll fill in the blanks of what they don't know. The deficit, I'll teach them. Then they'll be smart. Then they'll get it. We are subjective perceivers. Even when we have all the facts, we're going to perceive them through all the filters that are relevant to how we feel about things. A specific experiment in Australia, very, very interesting one. Super hippie, liberal, natural, wonderful community, like the one I live in. I can't remember the name. You might remember, Paul. A woman who lived there wanted to take advantage of that value to try and encourage people to consider vaccinating their kids. So she got a bunch of money and did a big public education campaign with all of the people of similar values saying, like a billboard, imagine this, right? So a dad holding the baby, right? There's one thing, right? Not the mom holding the baby. I use cloth nappies, recyclable diapers. I eat kale, or whatever the hell it was, and I vaccinate. You know, I am one of you. 1/3 of the community said it opened their mind. 1/3 of the community said, you're trying to trick me, to hell with you, and it had the backlash. Paul's right. Fear wins. Which fear is bigger?
And I just want to speak to, because I always promote parent-to-parent conversations, that those playground conversations, those little conversations that we have are very important. That, you know, the day that I made the appointment to get my son his HPV vaccine, I said, my son's getting his HPV vaccine today. And I said it right there at school. I had a conversation with 5 parents. They said, what's the deal with the HPV vaccine? I had a 2-second conversation about it. I didn't have to say very much, and I just made it a normal thing to do. Vaccinating's normal. 95% of parents vaccinate on time. It's a normal thing to do, and when parents realize that, I think a lot of the fears are really diminished.
There are pediatricians' offices in America who are, this was in JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association, who are kicking families out of their practices, who, despite repeatedly coming in for, hey, teach me about vaccines so I can figure out what to do for my kids, then call again next week and say, can we do that again? And what's really interesting is the pediatricians, and this is a few, the norm is that people may worry a little, but they trust their doctors. They're on their side, their personal doctors. But they're kicking them out of the practice not because, you would think, as Paul's suggesting, the unvaccinated kid next to the sick kid is a vector. They don't get paid for all of those conversations, and it's taking too damn much time because the education alone isn't working.
Although, I remember when we first started our program at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, I remember I was speaking to a group of about 100 parents who had chosen not to vaccinate, or at least delay vaccines for their children. And it was at night, it was like 7 o'clock at night, it was in a Jesuit church, I remember. And it was very tense in the room, actually, initially, and people had questions. They smelled the smoke. They wanted to know whether there was any fire there. I mean, people were reasonable, but it was tense in the room. And I was a member of the advisory committee for immunization practices at the CDC. I was sort of seen as other, and there was, during the talk, there was a toddler that sort of came up to the front of the room where I was sitting, and absently, I just sort of picked him up and put him on my lap. I mean, I'm the father of 2 children who at the time were young children, and I put him on my lap, and the whole room sort of tone changed. I mean, people now saw me as what I was, which was as a father, just like them, who cared, and I think that's part of it. People will often say, well, doctors say this, but parents want this. I mean, doctors are parents. It's the people who are on the ACIP are parents. People who work in pharmaceutical companies are parents. The people who make the vaccine are parents. I mean, we're all in this together, but we're so quick to dichotomize, not to our advantage.
Trust.
Okay. Well, look, as we wind down the program, I want to ask one last question to you all, and then have each of you speak for like 1 minute closing remarks on this topic. So this is the last question from the audience. With allowance of non-medical exemptions with high hurdles, you say, David, would that help defanging the anti-vaccine movement?
Help defend it?
Help
defang it.
Yeah. Taking a teeth out.
Well, so my argument was that so I don't like the language defang. I take the meaning of the question, though. It makes it harder for them to say you're forcing this down my throat if you're saying we're leaving a little wiggle room if your values are really deep and sincere. And it represents a more respectful relationship. And in other conflict circumstances around risk issues, showing respect for people's feelings and finding ways to demonstrate that with more than just words but actions does in fact diffuse some of the mistrust. But in some of the people who really hold these views so deeply because they're tribal and they're a group, all of my friends shop at Whole Foods or are libertarians or whatever, there's an importance to maintaining tribal loyalty. And getting rejected by the tribe, remember I talked about that earlier, is so important that you can't be okay with Paul Offit because it's being disloyal to that tribe. And no, some of that just can't be defanged.
Well,
I just think that when we talk about maintaining sort of the trust of the parents and making sure that we're being respectful of the parents. I think this would be a very different conversation if children voted. I do. I mean, it's just how about those children whose parents are committed enough to fill out all the forms they need to fill out, and then the child suffers? Who was representing them? I think that's our job.
And my answer is no. So no, allowing, getting rid of exemptions, allowing exemptions, that's not going to defang the anti-vaccine movement at all, because no matter what's going on, there will always be people who are just against vaccines. What defangs the anti-vaccine movement is parents who are vaccinating speaking up. Parents who are vaccinating, not being silent, and taking back the conversation. How many of us vaccinate? 99% of parents vaccinate, 95% on time. If we all said something about that, the anti-vaccine movement would be very, very quiet, because there are very, very few of them. And that's what defangs the anti-vaccine movement.
So speak to that. Why is it 95% of folks are vaccinating, but they're not heard?
Well, they're doing it as a matter of course. They bring in their children get vaccines, they're done with that, they move on with their lives. Their children, don't get measles and don't get mumps and they don't get sick, and so they don't think about it anymore. Unless they're forced to think about it, unless they're like Hannah and in a community where less than half of the kids are being vaccinated, or if they're like Ben's mom and he has leukemia and he's exposed to measles, and until they're faced with it, they don't realize that the threat is there and the threat is real if they allow their silence to remain.
So is it fair to say that because of the success of vaccines, that's why we have the problem we have now?
Yes.
They're a victim of their own success. Many experts here have said exactly that. That's what I mean about the fear tipping. Measles is gone. Why take the chance? Oops, Disneyland. They're not. Oh, let's ban it. Boom.
Fair. All right, well, Karen, your last words, 30 seconds.
My last words are, don't be silent.
All right, I'll give you 20 more seconds.
Okay.
That's all you don't have to do.
Don't be silent. And thank you, Philadelphia. It was nice coming out tonight. I think I've said everything I need to say. I have never had a tasty cake. I feel embarrassed about that.
Oh, come on.
We'll fix that.
We're walking back to the hotel together. We'll find us. What's the convenience store? Wawa.
We'll take
Jelly Crimpets. Show a hand. Jelly Crimpets. Butterscotch Crimpets.
Paul, 30 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, my children are both now 23 and 21 are both fully vaccinated, but you never really think it's going to happen to you. I mean, I never really imagined that my child would get, meningococcal disease or Hib or pneumococcus. I never imagined that. I mean, as we say, when vaccines work, absolutely nothing happens. But occasionally it does happen. And if you ever talk to these parents who are members of these activist groups or advocacy groups like Families Fighting Flu or Meningitis Angels or National Meningitis Association, these parents all tell the same story. I can't believe this happened to me. So you never think it's going to happen to you until it happens to you. So the goal is, don't be a member of a parent activist group. I mean, just make sure that you put your children in the safest position possible and get vaccines.
Great. David?
It's a really tough battle. So a couple thoughts came to mind while folks were talking. The fear of vaccines is as old as vaccines. When Edward Jenner thought that smearing some cowpox on kids might prevent smallpox, a bunch of people said, what? And some lady's kid got used as an experiment, and it worked, and the anti-vaccine movement was born. And various triggering events have come and gone that get grabbed by the media and blown up, and we have causes about the current one. It's persistent. It's persistent. Fortunately for us as beings that want to survive, most of us see where the larger threat is most of the time, and most of us get vaccinated. Yeah. Right? But there's one final point that I want to make, and it gets back to the flu thing. There's a secondary effect from this and the GMO argument and the argument about whether climate change is real and isn't real. And it's what I write about a lot. There's a phenomenon that I call the risk perception gap, by which I mean if there's a risk and we worry too much, so there's a gap, or we don't worry enough, and our behaviors as a result cause harm. The gap is a risk. Get it? Right? Driving drunk, not vaccinating our kids, and so forth. And there is, more broadly in society now than there's been in a long time, a general apprehension about vaccines. As many as 25% of Americans say, aren't they trouble? And in fact, to get to the flu point, a far, far, far greater public health risk than the childhood vaccination problem, which is real and needs work. A bad flu year can kill 39,000 Americans. That's 3 times as many as are shot to death. Why aren't we talking about that one? It's not kids. But when you look at the research about why people don't get their flu shots, there are 2 main reasons. It's only the flu. If you ever had the flu, you know that's not true. It knocks you on your butt. But they're not worried. Remember what I said about the fear thing winning? And right behind that is, I heard vaccines might be dangerous. That's a risk perception gap to society about a broad range of things that are vaccinable, including influenza, which is a humongous and under-talked about public health risk that comes from this risk perception gap. So the need for this thoughtfulness about this issue, along with our values, has a much broader implication than just the narrow questions that we've been talking about tonight.
David, I thank you for those 30 seconds. It's fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, absolutely appreciate your patience. There are many questions here. We will answer the questions, and you